The winter of 1836 swept across the Texas frontier with a ferocity that seemed almost personal, as if the land itself was warning settlers that they had ventured too far into territory that belonged to another people, another way of life. The snow came in waves, blanketing the prairies in white silence, transforming familiar landmarks into alien landscapes where survival itself became an act of defiance against nature's indifference. Among the scattered settlements that dotted this unforgiving terrain, the Morrison family had carved out what they hoped would be a permanent home. Thomas Morrison had brought his wife Martha and their 3 children west with dreams of land and prosperity, the same dreams that had lured thousands of others to push beyond the boundaries of what maps called civilization. Their cabin stood near a creek that ran clear and cold, surrounded by post oak and mesquite, a small fortress against the vastness that stretched in every direction. 8-year-old Sarah Morrison had hair the color of summer wheat, and eyes that carried the bright curiosity of childhood not yet dimmed by hardship. She helped her mother with the younger children, fed the chickens, and sometimes stood at the cabin's single window watching the prairie grass bend in waves beneath the wind, imagining what lay beyond the horizon. She had seen Indians before, watching from a distance as hunting parties moved across the land like shadows, and her father had told her they were dangerous, that she must always stay close to the cabin. But danger to a child is an abstract thing, a story adults tell, not a reality that touches the skin. The raid came at dawn when the snow was falling so thick it seemed the sky itself was collapsing. The Comanche warriors appeared like spirits materializing from the white curtain, their horses' breath steaming in the frozen air. There were perhaps 20 of them, and they moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this many times before. The attack was not born of random cruelty but of something deeper, a response to encroachments, broken promises, and the steady theft of hunting grounds that had sustained their people for generations. To the Comanche, these settlers were invaders, and raids were both warfare and a means of survival, a way to acquire horses, goods, and sometimes captives who might be ransomed or adopted into the tribe. Thomas Morrison managed to fire 3 shots before he fell. Martha gathered the younger children and tried to run toward the creek, but the snow was too deep and the warriors too swift. Sarah, who had been in the small root cellar fetching preserved vegetables, emerged to chaos. She saw her father lying motionless near the split-rail fence, saw warriors moving through the cabin carrying out blankets and tools, saw her mother's desperate flight cut short. Terror froze her in place for a heartbeat, and then instinct took over. She ran. The child plunged into the snow-covered prairie with no destination, only the animal need to flee. Behind her, shouts rose in a language she didn't understand. Her thin dress quickly became soaked with melting snow, and her bare feet, which had lost their shoes in the first desperate moments of flight, went numb almost immediately. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs could carry her no further, and then she collapsed into a drift that rose nearly to her shoulders. The snow continued to fall, and Sarah found herself trapped, unable to extract herself from the white prison. She was buried to her neck, only her head visible above the surface, her small body slowly disappearing beneath the accumulating snow. The Comanche warrior who found her was named Najwa in his own tongue, though he had been called other names in other times. He was perhaps 30 winters old, his face marked by the sun and wind, his body lean and hard from a life lived entirely in motion. He had participated in the raid not as its leader but as one among equals, for Comanche society valued individual prowess over rigid hierarchy. He had taken 2 horses and was riding back to rejoin the main party when he saw the small head protruding from the snow, the wheat-colored hair stark against the white. He might have ridden past. The raid had been successful, and the snow was getting worse. The child was clearly dying, would be dead within hours if left there, and her death would change nothing in the great sweep of events that were already in motion, the collision of 2 peoples who could not share the same land. But Najwa reined in his horse and sat looking at the small figure half swallowed by winter. Perhaps he thought of his own children, or perhaps he simply saw a human being in need. The Comanche were not a people of sentiment. Their survival depended on hardness, on making decisions that softer cultures could not make, but neither were they incapable of mercy. He dismounted and approached the child, who stared up at him with eyes wide with terror and cold. She tried to speak but could only manage a whimper. Najwa began digging with his hands, clearing away the snow that held her trapped. The snow was heavy and wet, and it took time to free her small body. When he finally pulled her out, she was shaking violently, her lips blue, her skin pale as the snow itself. He knew she wouldn't survive another hour in the open. Without hesitation, Najwa wrapped the child in his buffalo robe, the thick fur still warm from his own body heat. He mounted his horse and pulled Sarah up in front of him, holding her against his chest. She was too weak to struggle, too cold to do anything but accept this new reality. The warrior turned his horse and began riding, not back toward the scattered remnants of the raiding party, but in a different direction entirely. The journey that followed lasted 3 days, though Sarah would remember it later as a fever dream, a sequence of sensations rather than events. She remembered the warmth of the warrior's body, the steady rhythm of the horse's movement, the taste of pemmican that he pressed into her mouth when she was strong enough to chew. He stopped only when necessary, making small fires in sheltered spots where the wind couldn't scatter the flames. He rubbed her frozen feet until feeling returned, painful and burning, and wrapped them in strips of leather. He gave her water from his own supply and slept sitting up so that she could lie against him, using his body as a windbreak. Najwa spoke to her sometimes in Comanche, his voice low and steady, though she understood nothing. Perhaps he was telling her she would survive, or perhaps he was simply filling the silence that might otherwise have been filled with fear. He was a man accustomed to solitude, to long days on the prairie with only his horse for company, but he treated this small burden with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the warrior who had participated in the raid that had destroyed her family. They traveled through a landscape transformed by winter into something primordial and strange. The snow eventually stopped, and the cold hardened everything into a crystalline stillness. They passed through canyons where ice hung like frozen waterfalls, across frozen streams where the horses' hooves rang against the ice, through groves of bare trees that stood like skeletal hands reaching toward the gray sky. Sarah saw buffalo in the distance, dark masses moving slowly across the white prairie, and once a pack of wolves that followed them for a time before veering away in search of easier prey. On the 3rd day, they arrived at a Comanche camp, a collection of teepees nestled in a valley where the wind was less fierce and firewood was plentiful. Najwa rode directly to one of the larger lodges and dismounted, calling out in his own language. A woman emerged, her face weathered but kind, and she took one look at the small white child and began issuing instructions. Sarah was carried inside where it was warm, where there was food and soft buffalo robes and hands that touched her with care rather than violence. Najwa left her there. He had done what he set out to do, had carried this child across miles of frozen prairie for reasons he perhaps could not fully articulate even to himself. In the Comanche worldview, courage and compassion were not contradictory but complementary, different expressions of the same strength. A man who could kill his enemies without hesitation could also show mercy to the defenseless, and neither action diminished the other. Sarah Morrison would remain with the Comanche for 2 years before being ransomed back to white society, an event arranged through traders and negotiators who served as bridges between two worlds that were rapidly becoming incompatible. When she returned, she was no longer quite the same child who had fled into the snow. She had learned the Comanche language, had lived as one of them, had seen that the people her father called savages were also mothers and fathers, children and elders, people who loved and grieved and laughed. She carried memories that would never quite fit into the narrative her own people told about Indians, about good and evil, about civilization and savagery. And somewhere on the prairie, Najwa continued the life he had always known, riding with the seasons, following the buffalo herds, watching as the world he knew slowly contracted under the pressure of settlers and soldiers and broken treaties. Whether he remembered the small girl he had carried through the snow, whether that act meant anything special to him beyond a moment's decision on a winter day, no one can say. But for Sarah, who lived to be an old woman, the memory remained vivid until her final days. The warrior who might have left her to die but instead carried her to safety, the man who embodied everything her people feared yet who showed her a kindness she never forgot. In her old age, she would tell the story to anyone who would listen, insisting on a truth that made people uncomfortable, that the line between enemy and savior is sometimes carried by a single human being, and that mercy recognizes no boundaries that we draw on maps or in our hearts.